Okay, I've been getting a couple questions basically about the shimming, kind of just to clarify and get things understood. First thing to go over is when you have no grease on your gears and you spin them extremely fast, they kind of give a weird sound because they rattle into one another. So I don't usually spin them as fast. Remember, I said don't check for revolutions. That's just something I do not do because it doesn't need to be checked for revolutions. What it needs to be checked for is if there's pressure. If you remove the pressure completely, and you get the gears close enough to one another, it will still have the number of revolutions you need or more. So don't worry about checking for revolutions. What you're checking for is clearing the gears, making sure they move mechanically with as little resistance as possible, as little friction as possible. So your piston should be, with the spring, should be really the only resistance for the gears, same as the tappet plate with spring. That should be the only resistance for the gears. And the one directional resistance for the bevel should be the anti-reversal latch. So basically, I just say do not really go for revolutions. It's not something really good to go by, just counting the number of revolutions. That's just something. Alright, so here's a really good shim job. This is my demo gearbox. It's the G&G Armament GR16, and the gears in here are perfectly shimmed, even to the bevel for a pinion motor from G&G. So here's motor. But we go ahead and we spin this, and if you have a really good shim job, it's going to sound the same on both sides. It's going to sound pretty much the same straight up and down. Now the axles are applied a little differently when it's straight up and down, but it's going to sound the same however you rotate it. If you've got the friction the same all the way around, this is great. You can tell I've done an awesome job here. You should always check your shimming with the gearbox closed and screwed tight around the gears. Very tight, because that's how it's going to be. So let's go ahead and open this up and talk a little bit more here. Your bushings or bearings, the reason you want to glue them in is so they don't fall. Now a good reason for this is because they fall on the gear here, and the gear will rotate with it, and it will actually over time rotate in here, messing up the shell or messing up the bearing or bushing. Also, you can create a failure because your gears may actually fall into one another. So for instance, to kind of say, like let's say the bottom, let's say we put I've got to think here, best way to explain this. Let's say you have really good contact between the spur and the sector. It's about 95%, let's say pretty close to 100, but you can't have 100 of course, because then they would be rubbing against one another. But let's say they're really close, and you have one less shim on the top here of the spur, and gosh, I'm trying to think here. What's the best way to explain this? If you clear the bottom of these axles, the gear can't come down on top of it, so it can't right now. However, the spur gear right here can lift up. So nothing can be pushed down, but something can come up. So the spur gear could come up, and if it's 95% contact with the sector gear, with the teeth, it could come up and grind into it. And that's a good example. That's what I was trying to think of. When you have bushings and bearings that kind of move around. So with the really close teeth contact, that can be bad. It's also bad if they mess up the shell because they rotate in here. So you want to keep them solid as much as possible. If they torque in, you don't need to really glue them. If they don't, you're going to want to glue them. You could have different brands, and really a bushing is just a bushing. It's a solid piece of steel, and it's just put in there. Some will fit better than others because of the brand. It really just depends on that little tiny bit of a spec difference. So these are 8mm matrix, and nothing special about them. They're just okay, I guess decent, and they fit in here with torque. They also make the gears spin really nice. So you can see if they were really loose, you're going to want to glue them. Make sure you don't glue the bushing area getting into, or excuse me, the bearing area, all these ball bearings. Alright, so let's set that to the side. So as you rotate this, you can see how well it rotates. In my teeth contact, the general rule people try to stick to is as close as possible, but that is not really the rule for shimming. And some people might disagree with me on that, but I'm going to show you why. So you got your gears here, and you can see mine. They're a little bit further apart on the sector to the spur, but that's more than 50% contact. Same goes with the bevel. Now, the bevel to spur, it's more than 50% contact. If you have to move the bevel up, you are not going to have that close to 100% contact on the spur gear. Same goes with the sector gear. So to say as low as possible, really my rule is as low as possible to avoid certain things. So you start the spur gear really low so that when you put the sector gear in, it's really low, and you're just going over the cutoff lever that's going to be underneath it. You just have to go over it and actually be a little bit over the spur gear so it doesn't grind into it. That way, when you put the piston in, the top of the piston, the rail doesn't actually hit into the top of this gear, or the selector plate doesn't have pressure against the sector gear, because the higher the sector gear goes, the worse off it's going to be, and you're not going to be able to shim in between these two things. You have to be perfect for the piston, you have to be below the selector plate. So that's pretty much, just to clarify, 50% or better is good. I don't go as tight as possible. Reason being, let's say there's a 0.1mm difference between the spur and the sector. That is so close that it's almost rubbing on between the spur and the sector. And like I was saying, if your spur can move because of a bushing failure or a bearing failure, it can move because it's not staying within the shell, then you could have some damage. You'll definitely have some grinding against this body right here, or against the layering, I guess, of the spur gear. So I go just enough over the cutoff with the sector and stay below the selector plate, about perfect alignment with the piston teeth, and then just over the spur gear. Now I usually go about 0.2 over the spur gear. I'm going to tell you why. With 0.1mm, you close the gearbox up, it spins okay, but then you put another 1 on there, or you just take off the 0.1, put 0.2, and on the sector, and you spin it, and it spins better when you test it. The reason for this is because, like I said earlier, you got to know the difference between when there is resistance and when there isn't. If you're going as low as possible, sure, it looks like it spins good, but if you don't try and put that extra 0.1mm between the gears to see how much better it spins or worse, then you won't know. So for me to just say, okay, I'll put 0.1mm more on the sector, we're clearing the spur, it's not actually correct. You need to close it up, screw it down, test it, put a 0.1mm underneath the sector again, it's closed up, screw it down, test it. Hey, that spins better. Okay, then you know you can't put 0.1mm underneath the sector, it needs 0.2. Okay, if I could stop coughing, geez. Alright, the last thing I'm going to address is between the bevel and pinion. The bevel right now is 100% parallel. Right now, if I'm holding this straight. As soon as I put this underneath it, it should stay 100% parallel. See there? That is good. As I get closer, it starts to move the bevel up a little bit. You want to be a little bit before that. It's parallel here, it's parallel here. Okay, that's applying pressure right there. So you want to go a little bit back. That's parallel. You want to go a little bit less. That's where you should be. Now to test this, you actually can take your bevel gear here, and while it's in the body, you can take a flathead and run it in between one of these teeth right here, and basically you check like this. It will move a little bit, because once you have this up in here, it will move to between the teeth like this. Just to show again, it will move in between the teeth. See as I rotate. Now you never apply pressure to the bevel, and you never want to get too high up. You just want to be parallel to the teeth if you can. Sometimes the shape of your teeth are different, so you don't want to do that. But it depends what sets you're using. This best would be right here, just to show. Maybe this is the best camera position, I'm not sure. So, but there is tiny enough room in there that you can put a piece of paper through it and run the motor. I'm not suggesting that, I'm just saying as an example of image. Okay, that would leave a little bit of a gap, and that's what's supposed to be there, is a tiny bit of a gap between the bevel and pinion. I think that should pretty much explain, because this should be a little tiny bit away from the bevel, the tiniest bit, 0.1 millimeter away, and then you just adjust with the motor height. So this would be too high, then you just down a little bit. Okay, it's okay to go down a tiny bit, but you never want to get really past the 70%, because once you do, your motor isn't going to work. Going too high past 100% is bad too. But basically, if you can find that little bit of movement where it does this with your flathead, does that, and this is at the correct meshing point like that, then you are done. You are done, my friend. So I think that will clarify pretty much everything with shimming now. If you have any more questions, feel free to ask. Just make sure that this is completely running. Now, in my videos, you'll notice that the gearbox guns are supposed to run like an engine. They're perfectly tuned so as they just rotate like this. That's all they do, is they just keep rotating and getting their energy. And so, again, having 80% to 75% teeth contact is basically the exact same teeth contact between here, but is not the same for the bevel pinion. Bevel pinion should be about 70 to 100% if you can get it. You do not want to apply pressure to the bevel, and you want to be a tiny bit away from the bevel, from tooth to tooth. So you want to be underneath it while the bevel is parallel, and right before you break parallel, you want to be a little bit less than that. So because you don't want, as this rotates, it wants to get between the teeth. It doesn't want to touch the teeth. That's another great example, another really good informational point, is it doesn't want to touch the teeth. It just wants to rotate between them. All right. Hopefully that settles everything for now. I'll catch you guys later.